Hey there, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade Compass students. Welcome back to another week of Compass here. We are just maybe like a week and a half away from Christmas. I was going to record in the worship center today, but I guess our preschoolers are recording some of their Christmas program songs, so we'll have to be in my office this week, but that's okay. I would like to thank all of you that joined us for our party last week. It was a great time of playing Kahoot, and it was just great to see everybody, even if there were some shenanigans going on about names and all of that sort of stuff, or usernames. So thanks again for doing that, and thank you for taking part in our electives. Today, I'll be having a Bible study based on the movie Elf, starring Will Ferrell, and that'll be lots and lots of fun. And then there's also been this month-long kind of daily challenge or daily practice, if you will, for the month of December. And I think it's been going pretty good. So thank you to everyone who's been doing that. As always, if you have any questions about the process of Compass or an elective or turning things in, some of you have asked questions, and that's fantastic. But if you have one, even if you think it's the worst question ever, go ahead and ask it. We'd rather help you than have you get frustrated with this whole thing. So please do that. So last lesson, we talked about the first part of the birth story of Jesus. We talked about Mary, his mother, as well as Elizabeth, Mary's cousin. We talked about angels as well, and how angels kind of are part of this big surprise of how God is acting in the world, and how Mary and Elizabeth and even Zechariah responded. So I hope you enjoyed that. And this week we're going to take the next step. We're going to talk about a few other main players. We're going to talk about the shepherds, and we're going to talk about the magi. And we're going to see how those play into the Christmas story. And I hope that by kind of unpacking these larger themes, that you will find greater appreciation for the Christmas story, because it's not just this Charlie Brown cute little story. It's not like a greeting card. The Christmas story is really messy. So I really hope that you kind of dive deeper with me here, and that you come to Christmas Eve worship service exploring and thinking about how messy it was back then, and how God is born here in our messy times as well. All right, everybody, we'll see you in the next video. All right, everybody, so let's talk about those shepherds. And I want you to open up a Bible, preferably, or if you don't have one available to you, please go and pull up a web browser. Probably BibleGateway.com is going to be your best bet. And then let's open up our Bibles to the Gospel of Luke, which is in the New Testament. That's where we spent a lot of time last week. And so what I want to do now is, again, we were in chapter 1, so now let's go to chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. All right, so let's start by reading the first part of this birth narrative, Luke chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. All right, we're going to pause right there before we go to the shepherds, which is our next part. So this is kind of a messy story, remember? Mary and Joseph are not married. They traveled about 90 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So could you imagine a very pregnant woman traveling 90 miles, either by walking or, as a lot of Christmas cards tell us, on a donkey. That's a long ways to go. I mean, I was thinking, where would I walk 90 miles to or ride a horse 90 miles to? And the closest place I can think of is maybe going to the Twin Cities. Like, can you imagine walking that or riding a horse on that? That might be a little easier. Or riding a bike, definitely doable. But a very pregnant woman, that would be very, very hard. And so it's no surprise that when they finally get to where they need to be, she is ready to give birth. Now, another thing I want to talk about here is that this was all because there was supposed to be a registration, is what my Bible says. And really, that's a census. And so what the purpose of this was, the Roman government here was taking a census so they could properly tax and distribute military forces. So really, this wasn't like, oh, how many people do we have? Let's allocate funds where they need to go. Let's make sure everyone has the representation they need, kind of like when we do a census here in the United States now. The Jewish people were a conquered people, people under the thumb of the Roman government. And so the thought of going to be registered in a census wasn't necessarily a good thing for Mary and Joseph and every other Jewish person here in this area, because it meant that perhaps the Roman government was going to up their taxes and up that political and military oppression on them. So this wasn't really a good thing. And so there's this sense of anxiety and strife going on right now. But nevertheless, they go. And so they go, and it's time for Mary to give birth. And there's no place for them in the inn. And they wrap him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger. Now, this word inn really may not mean hotel, motel, that sort of thing. Inn might be more like there was no room in the main part of the house for them. And back then, if they had a 2-story house, archaeologists tell us that the animals lived on the main floor, just for in and out access. Then on the top floor, that's where people lived. So there was no place for them, not so much in the hotel or the motel. There was no place in the main living quarters. So they had to stay with the animals, which gets to the point of the story. And there was no place to lay him. There was no crib or bassinet. So they took a feeding trough with hay and laid him in it. So this is kind of a messy story already. So let's see how those shepherds play it. Whoa, fell asleep there for a second. Kind of reminds me of the shepherds here in the next part of Luke chapter 2. Let's watch and read. In that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Maybe they were sleeping. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Remember, they were terrified. People were also terrified when angels visited them last chapter. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid. For see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace among those whom he favors." All right, we'll pause there. I think it's important to note that the messiness of the story just continues. Now, if you were to tell someone super duper important news, how would you tell them and who would you tell? You'd probably tell the people that are most important to you first. You'd probably call them, text them, maybe run over to their house. But the angels just appear, right? And of course, the shepherds are terrified. And so they say, "Do not be afraid." And they go and tell them what they don't have to be afraid about, that there's this awesome news being born for them. The Messiah is being born today. So that's good news. But why the shepherds? Why are the angels talking to the shepherds? I mean, you'd think that the The angels might go to maybe like the local king or maybe Caesar, or what did Luke say here? Emperor Augustus, like tell the important people in that time about Jesus being born so that there could be a top-down strategy of telling everybody about who Jesus is. But that's not what takes place. Instead, the angels and God, really, works from the bottom up. Shepherds in those times were not really very high on the social hierarchy. I mean, they lived with animals. They were smelly and unclean. And sometimes shepherds, maybe this was their second job. Like they had a trade during the day, and then they'd have to go earn some extra money to help their family by watching sheep at night. So shepherds weren't really all that important. And they weren't who you'd think news of the Messiah's birth being told to go to, right? Just makes no sense. But for the Gospel of Luke, it is so important. Because Jesus and God in this Gospel are trying to tell us that God's good news, that love and grace and salvation, it doesn't just go to the highest of the high. Belongs to everybody. And so by going to those who absolutely need it, who maybe want to be restored into community and restored into a place of feeling important and whole, that's where the good news goes first, the people who need it most. And so it's so important here in the birth story that from the beginning, this good news of what Jesus is up to goes to the lowest of the low. And we continue to see that throughout the Gospel of Luke, that the good news of love, grace, peace, and mercy goes to the people who need it most. And if you don't remember, back in chapter 1, we read Mary's Magnificat, her song, and she says in one of those lines, where'd it go? He has shown, this is God, God has shown great strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. This is what God is doing. So who do you think if Jesus were born today, who might that good news go to? Probably not me. Who do you think it'd go to? Okay, so let's keep going in this story. We're going to pick up at verse 15. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us now go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, as it had been told them. After 8 days, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. Here ends the reading. So, we usually don't read that last verse there, but just thought I'd wrap up the story. So, this is the story that we hear almost every single Christmas Eve in the church. We hear about Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem. We hear about the angels going to the shepherds, and the shepherds going to the manger scene, which is great. They want to go and see what has been told to them. They want to see that the Messiah was born. But here's the important part, in my opinion. What do they do after? They go to the manger. They tell Mary and Joseph and all those gathered what they saw and what they heard. But what do? They don't go to seminary. They don't become preachers in the streets. They don't do any of that. Let's read that passage again. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen as it had been told to them. They go back to the fields. They go back to the sheep, but they do so praising God and glorifying God. I think every time we have this mountaintop experience of faith in our life, maybe it's at camp or Maybe it's on a mission trip, wherever and whatever it may be. We expect that this high might change our life forever and that we might just go gung-ho and change the world through our faith. But those mountaintop experiences, they never last. And so I think here the shepherds are telling us they had this mountaintop experience, but they take that momentum and instead of having these unrealistic expectations, they dive back into their jobs. They dive back into their everyday life. And they live their lives glorifying and praising God, even if it's being a shepherd, even if it is just paying the bills. They do so having been changed. And from that, they try to live out their faith. They live out their discipleship. So perhaps this Christmas season, we might be missing some of those really important worship services here at Trinity. When we attend Christmas Eve worship, we have the candlelight, we pass it around, we sing Silent Night and then Joy to the World. And we might miss that. We might miss that mountaintop experience. But the good news that Jesus is born, that's what's most important. And so that good news still goes into our lives, and we're called to live and praise and worship and glorify God, even if it is during COVID-19 times. The good news that Jesus is born still takes place. All right, so I want to lift up a book that I picked up when I was, I think, in college. Maybe it was seminary. I can't remember. But this is called Martin Luther's Christmas Book. And really what it is a collection of snippets of sermons by Martin Luther. And they're just themed on the different characters of the nativity story. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read just a couple little excerpts about the shepherds. And so I'm going to flip over to that page. And again, I've just got a few paragraphs marked. And I've used this in worship services, kind of like lessons and carols type thing, because they're really good reflections. So read a couple paragraphs, and then we're going to jump to the Magi. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. That was a mean job, watching flocks by night. Common sense calls it low-down work, and the men who do it regarded as trash. But the Gospel of Luke lauds the angels because they proclaim their message only to shepherds watching their flock by night. These were real shepherders. And what did they do? They did watch and keep as real shepherds do. They stayed in their station and did the work of their calling. They were pure in heart and content with their work, not aspiring to be townsmen or nobles, nor envious of the mighty. Next to faith, this is the highest art, to be content with the calling in which God placed you. I have not learned that yet. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were afraid. The field was flooded with light, brilliant and dazzling. Not the town, but the field was lighted up. Why did not the angel go to Jerusalem? There was the worship established by God. There were the princes of the people and the rulers in the church and state. There were the temple and the high priests ordained by God. Why did the angel not go to them? He went to Bethlehem, a dung heap compared with Jerusalem. And he did not go to the town of Bethlehem, but to the shepherds. And the angel said to them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. This joy is not just for Peter and Paul, but for all people. Not just to apostles, prophets, and martyrs does God say, but to you, come see the baby Jesus. Luther is echoing that sentiment that the good news goes to everybody, even the lowest of the low, perhaps first before the high and mighty. So, I hope you enjoyed that. And now let's go to the book of Matthew, which has the wise men, the three kings, or the magi, whatever you want to call them. Alrighty, so go ahead and open up your Bibles or your browser to Matthew chapter 1, and we'll go to Matthew chapter 2 as well. We're not going to go into Matthew chapter 1, but I'll just give you a quick summary. We're starting with this genealogy of Jesus, which is very important to Matthew. We believe Matthew is writing to a primarily Jewish audience, and so they are very familiar with the Old Testament here. And so this genealogy traces Jesus' roots all the way back to Abraham, which is very important because that gives him kind of this status within this furthering of the faith. So if you want to read chapter 1, that's great. 1 through 17 is a genealogy, but then just 18 through 25 is Jesus' birth story. And it's kind of cool because it focuses a little bit more on Joseph and Joseph's response. So you get both the female perspective and the male perspective in this birth story in Matthew and Luke. But we're going to skip that part, and we're going to go to Matthew chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, let's just pause there for a second. Wise men could also be thought of differently, but let's pause there. In fact, we often call them the three kings, and we do that because the gifts that they bring Jesus are what? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So we think a gift per person, three kings. May not be so. In fact, the Bible doesn't say how many people actually went, just that there were multiple. Could have been 2, could have been 8, could have been 100. Who knows? So we have that, but also this Greek word for wise men is literally magi. Does that sound like another word? Magi? If you add a C to it, it spells what word? Magic. You see, these magi, these wise men, these magicians, were probably of a completely different faith. In fact, Old Testament and New Testament scholars think that these magi might be what's called Zoroastrians. It's an ancient faith that was practiced in Persia and a lot in the Middle East. In fact, there was a whole empire with this faith of Zoroastrianism. And there are some parallels to Christianity, kind of this mighty God versus kind of this kind of lesser evil God. So you could see that good versus evil type of dichotomy. But there are a lot of other similarities as well. But we have good news going to the Magi, people outside the Jewish, Christian, Islamic tradition. Interesting, isn't that? That God would send good news or kind of open the minds of people outside the faith. And that they would come and worship Jesus. They would pay him homage. I think this sort of theme of God going beyond our imaginations, going beyond boundaries of where we might think and send the good news is being displayed here once again. That Jesus' birth is so important that it just doesn't go to people within the circle. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond our own ideas of where it should go. So here we have the good news of Jesus' birth going to the Magi, going to people of the Zoroastrian tradition, which blows my mind and makes me think, how is God working in bigger ways than I can imagine right here and now in 2020? Sometimes I think I know what God is up to, but when I read passages like this, I'm just blown away because God is up to bigger and better things than I could possibly imagine. Let's keep going. Alrighty, so we kind of stopped at the middle of a verse. In fact, we stopped at Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. So let's keep going with verse 2. Where is the child who is born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Again, this is important. Jesus is fulfilling some prophecy, fulfilling some narratives of promises from God earlier in the Old Testament. So again, we're going back to these Jewish roots. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, the Magi, and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. All right, let's unpack this a little bit. So King Herod is the local ruler of the Roman government, but we also believe he was of the Jewish tradition, so he had some sort of sway with the community. Now, King Herod did not want to lose control. He didn't want to lose his power in the area. So he was jealous that there might be this baby, this potential threat to his rule. And so he tried to learn about where Jesus was born. And so the astrologers, these magi, tell him what they had heard and learned from their own tradition and looking at the stars. But they just keep going. They go to Bethlehem and find baby Jesus. And here's where we get another clue as to what Jesus is all about. When they give him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that's the clue. Why would a baby born to Mary and Joseph get these pretty important gifts, these wealthy, costly gifts? Well, gold might be given because they recognize Jesus as ruler, as king, as greater than King Herod, greater than Emperor Augustus. So there's a clue as to what who Jesus is. But then frankincense and myrrh, like, what are those? Chances are you've never smelled frankincense or myrrh. Someone once gave me a beard balm that was called Wise Men, and it had frankincense and myrrh mixed in, but it's very fragrant. It has this little spicy note to it. But tell you what, the whole point of frankincense and myrrh is to anoint somebody. It's a blessing. But even more than that, frankincense and myrrh back then were used as ointments, as perfumes that they would place on dead bodies. When they wrapped people in bands of cloth in the tomb, they would put this perfume on them to prevent any stench, really. Interesting, isn't that? That they would give him gifts of perfume to this child who was laying in bands of cloth in a manger, only to be used when he's wrapped in bands of cloth in a tomb. We have a foreshadowing here in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus is going to die, but with a great purpose. Jesus' death is all about displaying his power and his might over death. So while we might think these are cute little gifts, costly gifts, expensive gifts, the illusion here is that Jesus' death shows just who he is and how important he is. Let's keep going. Okay, let's keep going. We're going to go to verse 13 of Matthew chapter 2. Now after the Magi had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated and sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. We're going to skip a little bit more here, but we have a pretty gruesome scene here that Herod is so infuriated that the Magi didn't come back to him and that he had Jesus had possibly fled, that he decided to massacre all boys 2 years and younger. And that is absolutely gruesome and disgusting and horrible. But again, we have this allusion here back to the Old Testament, which is so important in the Gospel of Matthew, to the story of Moses, who is kind of rescued by his mother by putting him in a basket in the river, the Nile River, to escape the bloodshed that is happening. Because in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh is slaughtering all the boys, again, because he's trying to squash any uprising, to squash another generation of possible turmoil and strife, and to keep the people subjected under his rule. The same is going on here with Herod. Herod, out of fear and anxiety and political, what do I want to say? He wants to hold on to that political power. He slaughters any threat. That's frightening. And so God sends a message through an angel to Joseph to get up and flee to Egypt. Interesting. Jesus is a refugee. Jesus is a refugee. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are refugees, and they flee to Egypt because of political persecution. I think it's interesting that we get so caught up here in the United States about refugees and whether or not they should be here. And a lot of the people who say that are Christians. And yet, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is a refugee. He fled political persecution. Whatever your stance is on refugees, whether you are inviting people to come and live in America or you don't want any, I think this text gives us pause to consider and wonder just what God is up to. Because if Jesus was a refugee, I think we're called to look at our neighbors just as the Egyptians did to Mary and Joseph and Jesus. They welcomed them. They kept them safe. Might we do the same? Something to think about. It's a very tricky text. So let's go to what Luther has to say about the Magi next. Alrighty, let's keep going here with these Magi, these three kings, these wise men, whatever you want to call them. So again, we're going to read from Luther's Christmas book. When they opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Though they saw but a tumbled-down shack with a poor young mother and a poor little babe, not like a king at all, meaner than one of their own servants, they did not shrink, but in great strong faith cast out all misgivings of common sense, and following simply the word of the prophet and the witness of the star, they accepted him for a king, fell on their knees, worshipped him, and presented their treasures. The world would not have done so, but according to her want would have looked for a velvet cushion and a host of servants and maids. The world makes presents to those who already have enough, and to provide them snatches the bread from the mouths of the hungry who have nothing but what they earn with their bloody sweat. If we Christians would join the wise men, we must close our eyes to all that glitters before the world and look rather on the despised and foolish things, help the poor, comfort the despised, and aid the neighbor in need. Do not boast that you have built churches and endowed masses. Let us then observe how the wise men took no offense at the mean estate of the babe and his parents, that we may also not be offended in the mean estate of our neighbor, but rather see Christ in him, since the kingdom of Christ is to be found among the lowly and the despised in persecution, misery and the holy cross. Those who see Christ anywhere else find him not. The wise men discovered him not at Herod's court, not with high priests, not in the great city of Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem, in the stable, with lowly townfolk, with Mary and Joseph. In a word, they found him where one would have least expected. So true, Luther, so true. The wise men found him where they least expected, but they had that faith and that courage to go and search wherever they understood that star, that prophecy to tell them. And so they went. So how are you looking for God, and how are you looking for Christ's birth here in 2020? Again, we might look to those mountaintop experiences, but just like those shepherds, I think God appears to us in our everyday lives. God appears to us in hugs, if we can have one. God appears to us in a text message or a phone call. God appears to us in those just shiny glimmers of hope when we need it most. God appears to us when we need that helping hand. God appears to us when we least expect. How have you experienced God's presence lately? If you feel like you need to talk to someone, if you feel like you're in a rut and you need that helping hand, that word of peace, feel free to reach out to me or Ashley. We'd love to be that word of hope and peace to you in this Christmas season in the midst of COVID-19. Now, one thing we didn't really talk about was the Christmas star, the Bethlehem star, which is kind of an interesting thing. What we don't really know what the Bethlehem star is, but we have ideas as to what it might be. And one of my grandfather, he was a pastor. My grandfather had a congregation, and one of his congregation members was an astronomer, which meant he studied the stars in a scientific fashion. And his thing was to try and figure out just what the Bethlehem star was. So I will post an article of that in the comments or something like that here for you to check out. But also, this coming week, I believe it's Monday the 21st, which is the longest night. It's the winter solstice. NASA tells us that, I think it's Jupiter and Saturn are going to be so close aligned that they're going to be the brightest they've been in 800 years. And they get in alignment every 20, but because of certain conditions, they're going to be the brightest ever. And they call this the Bethlehem star. So perhaps it wasn't just a star, but planets aligning in such a way that they appeared super bright. So go check out a NASA article and this article from my grandfather's parishioner, and maybe go look for the presence of Christ in your life this week. Alrighty, everybody, you have survived yet another week of Compass here with me in my office. I appreciate you paying attention and really focusing in on how messy this Christmas story really is. It's not this beautiful, picturesque scene. It really is quite messy. So I hope when you go to Christmas Eve worship with us here at Trinity, that you might think about how this really is not just this Hallmark story. It's real and it's raw, it's dirty, it's messy, it's full of political strife. It's a perfect story for 2020. So, please do that on Christmas Eve, and we are going to have worship premiered on Facebook at 4 o'clock. However, we'll have a link available if 4 o'clock doesn't work out for you. If you would rather worship at 11 or noon or 1 or 8 or 10 o'clock at night, we'll have links available for you to do that. But we'll gather together as a digital community on December 24th at 4. So let's look at our schedule coming up here. So the 23rd and the 30th, you have off. You don't have to do anything. That's great. So we'll have our next lesson on January 6th. January 6th. So please log back in, and we're going to have electives up before then. So go back to Seesaw. I believe it's next week. I think on Monday or Tuesday, we're going to have our electives posted for January. So check that out next Monday or Tuesday. Again, as always, if you have any questions, you need to reach out. Don't be afraid to contact myself, Pastor Tom, Pastor Patrick, or Ashley Olson. All right, everybody, Merry Christmas, and we'll see you after the new year.